Ihr Hochschule Referenten gekommene von weit und von neuend im Namen von der Verwaltung von Jüdischen Wissenschaftlichen Institut. Bruchem Haboim Hochschule Gäst. Ihr habt das Programm in Hand und im Grund redet das Programm für sich allein. Nur von deswegen hat man gehalten, als wollte gut gewesen, Masbir zu sein, dem Gedank von der Konferenz, und mir hat man zugeteilt dem Covid. Das Beste ist öfter, wie oft in solchen Fällen, anzuheben.
Those were the words of Max Weinreich when he began the conference in 1964 on the subject of Jews and progressive social movements in the world. I'll translate a little bit of what Max said at that time. Welcome, distinguished panelists who have come from near and far, as they have today. On behalf of the administration of the Jewish Scholarly Institute, YIVO, welcome, distinguished guests. You have in your hands the program, which basically speaks for itself, but somebody thought that it should be explained, and this honor fell to me. This I won't do. The most sensible approach is probably to present the topic of the conference from a historical perspective. YIVO, from its very beginning, has appreciated the value of Jewish social movements in modern Jewish history. Among the publications of the Vilna period, the monumental volume produced in 1937 immediately comes to mind. It contains over 800 large pages and was compiled with the participation of 25 scholars. It was edited by Elias Cherikover, Franz Kursky, and Avram Rosen, a.k.a. Ben Adir. And may he live for many years to come. Abraham Menes. In New York in the early 40s, the two large volumes appeared concerning the prehistory and early history of the Jewish workers' movement in America, edited by Elias Cherikover, and containing the work of a number of contributors. However, we have not had the ability to continue their work. And Weinreich goes on to say that we have not had the ability to continue their work because of the war, because of the destruction of East European Jewry, and because of the desire on the part of most American Jews to forget their East European past. However, this is still important work to do, and the YIVO Institute is recommitting itself precisely to this work, and this conference is a sign of that commitment. The commitment to re-engage with our Eastern European heritage, not at the level of objects and memories, but at the level of serious investigation and serious thinking about who the Jewish people is, what it did, what it thinks, whether there is such a thing as the Jewish people, asking fundamental questions about what we are here in America. In the period following the Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1939 and the subsequent division of Poland, the Soviet Red Army occupied Lithuania and began the process of destroying Jewish cultural and political organizations. It was during this time that Menachem Begin was arrested by the NKVD as a Zionist activist, and with many thousands of other Jews was deported to Siberia. At exactly the same time that Begin was arrested and deported, Zalman Razin, one of the principal leaders of the YIVO Institute in Vilna, was shot by the Soviets. Razin, with Max Weinreich, was the head of the philological section of YIVO and was responsible for research in the area of language and literature, particularly having prepared an anthology of old Yiddish literature and a textbook von Mendelssohn bis Mendele. Why was he shot and Begin simply arrested and deported? Von Mendelssohn bis Mendele and a textbook of old Yiddish literature hardly seem as threatening to Soviet power as the active organizing of a fanatical young Zionist. The Soviets did one thing additional. that helps explain their actions. They dissolved YIVO as an independent institution and made it part of the Institute for Lithuanian Studies, renaming it the Jewish Cultural Institute. Why? YIVO is der Jiddischer Wissenschaftlicher Institut, the Yiddish or Jewish Research Institute. What is the difference between Wissenschaft and Kultur? The difference may seem minute, but it is one the Soviets were keenly aware of, as wrong-headed as they often were. In this case, they were not wrong. Wissenschaft is scientific research in the European sense, whereas Kultur is museums, exhibitions, material objects, facts. Wissenschaft is inquiry, questioning, and interpretation of those facts. Culture is appreciation. Wissenschaft serves the purpose of establishing a lineage, a conscious national idea, in the words of another YIVO founder, Shimon Dubnov. Whereas Kultur leaves the national idea latent in objects unconscious, not an idea, but a feeling. The Soviets recognized that real inquiry was dangerous and that Jewish nationalism posed a threat, even in the form of a textbook of old Yiddish literature, because the work of the YIVO Institute was to build a self-conscious national Jewish identity. They also recognized something else. Institutions were more dangerous than individuals, even individuals like Menachem Begin, who, as we know, was a very dangerous individual. Today, such distinctions seem sufficiently innocuous and remote, yet the very phrase culture section of daily newspapers in the United States suggests how tranquilized culture has become, neutralized and neutered, so to speak, of any real political value or importance, as in the words of T.S. Eliot, women come and go, speaking of Michelangelo. The YIVO Institute remains a Wissenschaftlicher Institute today, yet Jewish life in the American diaspora, secular Jewish life that is, for the most part lacks the incentive for attaining a national idea and is content with its enjoyment of cultural identity and appreciation of cultural ideals, newfangled bagels, quaint revivals of Fiddler on the Roof or klezmer music, appreciation of the contribution of Jews to science, art, medicine, law, and a multiplicity of other aspects of American life, but in ways that make it possible for the specifically Jewish dimension of this activity and creativity to remain more or less invisible, that is, latent, unconscious, as Dubnov wrote. Or a matter of history, the past, not something to be acted on in the present. The Jewish national idea became explicitly and consciously realized in the founding of the State of Israel, and this split between cultural identification and national realization is an essential component of the dialogue between Israel and its diasporic cousin in America today, the dialogue between national idea and cultural ideals in Jewish life. The heated nature that this dialogue often takes and takes today in many quarters, as evidence from the fact that we've completely sold out this conference, some of which will be represented at this conference over these next 2 days, shows clearly enough that it remains a fundamental and vivid element of Jewish life today throughout the Jewish world, something that is still struggling to find resolution, something as yet unfinished and uncompleted in Jewish history. The diaspora continues to play an essential role in this dialogue, for the Jewish national idea became possible only because of the underlying national feelings that aroused it in the 19th century. And it is nonsense to think that the two sides of this dialogue are not intimately connected, sharing many core assumptions and values. In this sense, the YIVO Institute is ideally positioned to participate in and provide the theoretical framework for this dialogue, and I am delighted that we are able to do so now by hosting this conference, Jews and the Left, which was historically so important in the ideological construction of the Jewish nation-state of Israel. My personal and YIVO's collective gratitude go to Jack Jacobs, first of all, who instantly and positively responded to the idea of this conference when we first spoke of it toward the end of 2009. and Jack assumed the task of leading the steering committee and organizing it. My sincere appreciation and thanks go to the members of the steering committee, Jack Jacobs, Deborah Hertz, Jonathan Karp, who is the director of the American Jewish Historical Society, which is a co-sponsor of this conference, Tony Michaels, Anthony Polanski, and Daniel Sawyer, for their many ideas and selfless contributions. The small YIVO staff, small but highly disciplined and mobilized, our cadre of young YIVO Bolsheviks, has been led by Suzanne Leon, Assistant Director. This conference could not have been realized without Suzanne's superior intelligence and organizational abilities. But it is her dedication to YIVO, our mission and our future, that has made the present program possible, as well as the many other public programs YIVO has undertaken over the last 2 years. I wish to thank all the members of the YIVO conference team, Suzanne, Andrew Koss, Krisha Fisher, who curated the exhibition on the mezzanine, which I urge all of you to see. It's really quite an amazing collection of materials from our photo archives having to do with the Jewish left-wing press. And Eve Gecker, who was responsible for the tape that is in the Great Hall of the images, the cartoons and so on and so forth, and is our photographer for today. All have worked with tremendous energy and commitment, but I would like to single out Alex Brandwine, who has demonstrated extraordinary grace under pressure in designing and producing the flyers, the ads, the brochures, the program, the background reader, exhibition poster, and has been in charge of innumerable other details. The conference team has been supported by the invaluable work of our volunteers, Jason Tingler and Jennifer Young, who you will see walking all around as we get into the questions and answers later. YIVO gratefully acknowledges the co-sponsorship of this conference by the American Jewish Historical Society and the financial contributions from the Atran Foundation, which we discovered in our archives was the sole supporter of the 1964 conference that Max Weinreich earlier welcomed you all to. The David Berg Foundation and Dr. Joseph K. McLaughlin. Our final thanks go to Sam Norridge, publisher and executive director of the Forward Association, and to the Forward Association itself, which has provided additional support and whose history, like YIVO's, is inextricably linked to the subject at hand, and whose editorial point of view is lampooned in many of the cartoons that we have on the mezzanine. Thank you all. Thank you all very, very much for coming, and we shall get on with the program.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Karp, the director of the American Jewish Historical Society, and on behalf of the American Jewish Historical Society, AJHS, I want to thank all of you for joining us at this conference. It's heartening to see so many old comrades out in the audience today, by friends. Having moved temporarily from academia to the administration of a nonprofit like the AJHS, I've now started to look at scholarly conferences a little bit differently. I've realized that they can be somewhat like the Oscars, although not nearly as boring, but still overfilled with expressions of gratitude and appreciation. So I'll try to be brief in issuing my own. I want to thank my colleagues on the organizing committee, as Jonathan Brent clearly expressed as well, for approaching this task with such diligence and dedication, and especially to Jack Jacobs and Jonathan Brent for the thoughtfulness and deliberation of their planning. I'm particularly grateful to Jonathan and YIVO for inviting the AJHS to be a part of this event. The AJHS, which celebrates its 120th anniversary this year, holds countless collections from the 16th to the 21st century, a number of which are pertinent to our topic today, including the Samuel Gompers collection, papers of the Workmen's Circle, those of various Jewish labor unions, and the papers of the American Jewish Congress, which had strong socialist involvement, of course, to name but a few. One of our most interesting collections documents the Jewish counterculture of the 1960s and 70s with all of its earnestness, playfulness, menschlichkeit, and mishigas. And we will have a panel on that topic tomorrow. While the AJHS has its own stake in this conference, as a historian, I also have high expectations. It's hard to think of a more fateful encounter in modern Jewish history than that of Jews and the left. Some of the most admirable engagements of Jews with modernity, in the labor movement, in significant strains of Zionism, in the civil rights movement, to cite only a few examples, were mediated through left-wing identifications, organizations, and causes. On the other hand, Jews paid a heavy price for their identification with the left. In part, this had to do with the remarkable overrepresentation of Jews in some communist regimes. Hungary's short-lived Soviet Republic of Bela Kun in 1919, for instance, included 20 of 23 government ministers who, like Kun himself, were of Jewish origin. While the number of Jews in the Russian Bolshevik Party was small, the visibility of prominent leaders like Trotsky and Zinoviev, however much they renounced or disdained Jewishness, lent credence to the libel of Judeo-Bolshevism, coined by the whites during the Russian Civil War and taken over by the National Socialists and other fascists in the 1920s. A similar overrepresentation was evident in Poland's post-war communist regime under Boleslav Bierut, fodder, I have noticed, for Arab anti-Semitic propaganda even today. According to one study from 1944 to 54, 167 of 450 leading members of Poland's Ministry of Public Security were, quote, Poles of Jewish origin. While these participants were anything but representative of the larger Jewish community, the fact of their disproportionality did flow ultimately from the broader Jewish attraction to and involvement in the socialist left, of which communism was only the most noxious variant. Understanding the sources of this phenomenon still constitutes one of the most complex and necessary tasks for historians of modern Jewry. As a student of Jewish economic life, I would suggest that European Jewry's distinctive occupational profile and inheritance of the Middle Ages and the problem it posed throughout the drawn-out history of Jewish emancipation struggles is one place, if only one, to look for answers. Socialism seemed to offer a plausible solution to the problems associated with Jews and capitalism, whether they be an impoverishment of Jewish workers on the one hand, or on the other, an excess of middlemen and Luftmenschen. The latter gave rise to a perception, both among Jews and non-Jews, of Jewish abnormality in the economic sphere, for which socialism might provide the antidote. I mention this partly to emphasize what a difficult task it is to think carefully, analytically, and dispassionately about the very loaded topic of Jews and the left, even today, when many of the familiar battles seem stale and antiquated. It is my fervent hope that this conference will make a substantive contribution toward advancing our understanding of the important issues proceeding from the encounter between Jews and the left. I hope we'll avoid the Scylla of sentimentality and the Charybdis of demonization. Given the quality of the scholars participating, I have little doubt that we will succeed. Which leads me to do again what I promised I would not, issue another thank you, or repeat another thank you. I'd like to conclude by offering my special thanks to the staff of YIVO, including the Assistant Director, Suzanne Leon, for so beautifully laying the table, so to speak, so that we can now enjoy a feast of scholarship and ideas. I'd now like to introduce a great exemplar of that scholarship, the conference's steering committee chair, Professor Jack Jacobs.
Welcome. Individuals of Jewish origin have played highly visible roles in the leadership of leftist movements around the world. In the first half of the 20th century, significant numbers of Jews in Eastern Europe, in the US, and elsewhere supported left-wing political parties. In addition to participating in general leftist movements, Jews created a number of distinctive Jewish socialist parties, several of which ultimately had considerable influence. Why were there so many leftist luminaries with Jewish backgrounds in the 19th and 20th centuries? Why were there so many rank-and-file Jews sympathetic to left-wing causes? It is the intent of my remarks this morning to outline some of the major responses that have been given in the past to these questions, and to attempt to assess the extent to which these responses ring true today. The left arose out of the French Revolution and was initially committed to that revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Left-wing movements later came into being in many other lands, and the left ultimately grew to encompass a range of views, including notably socialist, communist, and anarchist perspectives. In general, movements such as these tended to favor equal treatment and opposed the legal disabilities which had been imposed upon Jews in various localities in earlier times. To be sure, specific, highly visible leaders of the left, the Russian anarchist Bakunin for one, were not immune from anti-Jewish prejudices. However, the left was often open to the participation of individual Jews within its ranks in ways that the European right was not. And many late 19th century leftists, though not all, ultimately opposed the anti-Semitic political movements that came into being in that era. It was by no means the case that outspoken opposition to political anti-Semitism and personal attitudes rooted in prejudice or stereotypes were mutually exclusive. Nevertheless, it is significant for our purposes that German social democracy, the world's strongest Marxist-influenced movement in the latter decades of the 19th century, was somewhat less anti-Semitic than any other major political party in Imperial Germany. Much the same, I believe, can be said about the relative positions of many Marxist-oriented socialist or social democratic parties in other lands, both in that era and in the first decades of the following century. The relative openness of those attracted to the left made it possible not only for individuals of Jewish origin to become founders of leftist movements, but also in some cases to become leaders of such movements. Karl Marx and Ferdinand Lassalle, who were of Jewish descent, are manifestly among the most important mid-19th century leftists. Exceptionally prominent leftists of Jewish origin in the generations immediately following those of Lassalle and Marx include Edward Bernstein and Rosa Luxemburg, Victor Adler and Otto Bauer, Emma Goldman and Alexander Bergman, Pavel Axelrod and Leon Trotsky. This list of world-renowned figures, to which we could easily add many other names, should not be taken as suggesting that most leftist leaders have been Jewish. Nevertheless, in the first decades of the 20th century, there were not only a remarkable number of Jews in prominent positions in leftist parties, but also a disproportionately high number of Jews in somewhat lower positions and even in the rank-and-file membership of certain such movements. 18 of the 29 People's Commissars, by my count, in the government of the Hungarian Soviet Republic of 1919 were Jewish. Official communist sources not inclined to exaggerate on this subject once estimated that 35% of the membership of the Communist Party of Poland was Jewish in 1930. Though Jews were at one time highly visible in the leftist movements of countries such as Hungary or Poland, This fact does not by any means imply that most Jews in these countries were affiliated with leftist parties. The total number of members of the Polish Communist Party in 1930 was in the neighborhood of 6,600. To say that 35% of the members of the Polish Party in that year were Jews is to suggest that considerably less than 1% of the Polish Jewish population was formally affiliated with the Communist Party of that land. At the same time, we must also keep in mind that Jews created during the 19th and 20th century not only non-Jewish leftist movements, but also any number of movements with explicitly Jewish leftist orientations. Urbanization, modernization, pauperization, and the decline of rabbinic authority all contributed to the sparking of left-wing sentiment among East European Jews and among Jews who left Eastern Europe to settle in other parts of the world. In the era of the Revolution of 1905, there were no less than 4 major ideologically distinct Jewish socialist parties active in the Russian Empire. The Jewish Workers' Bund, which was Marxist and anti-Zionist in orientation, became the most powerful Jewish party in many of Poland's largest cities on the eve of the Second World War. East European Jews who immigrated to the United States established left-leaning institutions like the Workmen's Circle, which eventually became far larger than their counterparts in the old country. So I return to the questions I posed a few minutes ago, and I ask, first of all, how has the prominence of Jews in leftist movements been explained in the past? In a book on political parties, which first appeared in 1911 and which is still widely known today, the German-born sociologist Robert Michels noted that what he called the abundance of Jews among the leaders of the socialist and revolutionary parties could be explained by reference to, in his words, specific racial qualities. According to Michels, these qualities included, and I'm quoting him now, that sectarian fanaticism which, like an infection, can be communicated to the masses with astonishing frequency, an invincible self-confidence, which in Jewish racial history is most characteristically displayed in the lives of the prophets, a still more remarkable ambition, an irresistible need to figure in the limelight, and last but not least, an almost unlimited power of adaptation. End quote. According to Michels, I quickly add, these qualities had apparently led Jews to prominence not only in leftist movements, but also in political movements with very different complexions. He declared that Jews are capable of organizing every kind of movement. But Michels stressed that what he referred to as persons of the Hebrew race were predominant in his day in parties with labor-oriented, left-wing orientations. Some scholars interested in the relationship between Jews and the left, past and present, have emphasized not supposed Jewish qualities, as had Michels, but rather purported similarities or affinities between Jewish religious ideas and ideas supported by leftist writers. Dennis Fishman, for one, argued in a book devoted to Karl Marx and the Jewish question that Marx, quote, approaches the standpoint of the Jewish tradition, end quote. Michael Loewy, a friend of mine and a prominent contemporary French academic born into a Jewish home, far more compellingly makes creative use of a term he learned from Max Weber, elective affinity. Weber, many of you are likely to recall, described the Wahlverwandtschaften, the elective affinities between forms of religious belief and practical ethics, and in particular between the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Loewy, in turn, has written of an elective affinity illuminating links between Jewish messianism and a revolutionary libertarian worldview. And he suggests that ideas associated with Ernst Bloch, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, Gustav Landauer, Leo Leuwenthal, George Lukács, among others, can all be clarified to varying degrees through reference to the affinity which Loewy describes at length. A third, alternative explanation for the attraction of some very prominent Jews to leftist ideas revolves around Jewish marginality. Isaac Deutscher, who was raised in a strictly Orthodox milieu, was ordained as a rabbi at an early age and later became a Trotskyist, famously claimed that Marx and Luxemburg, among others, dwelt on the borderlines of various civilizations, religions, and national cultures, and were born and brought up on the borderlines of various epochs. This, Deutscher proposed, and I'm quoting here Deutscher's 1958 talk to the World Jewish Congress, which was later published under the title The Non-Jewish Jew, enabled them to rise in thought above their societies, above their nations, above their times and generations, and to strike out mentally into wide new horizons. Deutscher's explanation for the one-time link between these specific Jews and the left, the fact that it's colored by his political sympathies notwithstanding, has a great deal of merit. Jewish marginality and the political, economic, and sociological conditions which existed in the 19th and 20th centuries and which led to such marginality does in fact help to explain the political inclinations of any number of prominent Jewish leftists of earlier times in ways that neither purported Jewish racial characteristics nor interpretations of the Jewish religious tradition can. The notion that Jews are a race has long since been discredited by reputable social scientists, if not necessarily by all geneticists. The idea that Judaism per se is intrinsically progressive is not tenable. Jews were, however, quite definitively marginal when the left came into being and in the era during which it developed. This marginality does, in fact, help to illuminate historic ties between Jews and the left. But where do we stand today? Let's take a very fast look at Jewish political opinion in the world's major Jewish communities. The State of Israel had a string of labor-dominated governments in its founding decades. Labor Zionist thinkers such as Berel Katznelson were sympathetic to socialist ideas and were widely admired by many Israelis of an earlier generation. Many kibbutzim, the Israeli trade union movement, and other significant Israeli institutions were controlled in an earlier era by labor Zionists steeped in the works of people like Katznelson. But these institutions have decreased very markedly in power over time. The people of Israel have, in recent years, elected right-wing governments with nationalistic platforms. I'll leave it to the specialists here among us to help us understand why this change occurred, but I venture to suggest that the decline of leftist ideas in Israel seems to me to be related to three different phenomena, which I list here in no particular order. Number one, immigration patterns. Number two, matters related to the ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And three, changes in the class composition of Israeli society. Jews in France, home to the largest Jewish population in Western Europe, were in the recent past sympathetic to Socialist Party candidates. François Mitterrand, the only socialist ever elected to serve as president of the French Fifth Republic, or maybe I should say the only socialist until today, apparently received a plurality of the votes of French Jews both in 1981 and in 1988. However, the Jewish population of France reportedly did not give comparable support to the socialist candidate in the presidential election of 2007. Fears within the French Jewish population of rising antisemitism seemed to have increased sympathy among French Jews in 2007 for the law and order policies associated with Sarkozy, who is partially of Jewish origin, as did the perception among some pro-Zionist Jews in France that Sarkozy had taken pro-Israel positions. It appears as if a large proportion of the Jews of France voted for Sarkozy, candidate of the right-of-center Union for a Popular Movement in 2007, and I anticipate that when things settle down, we're going to discover that many Jewish voters in France continue to support Sarkozy right now, even though I really do think the socialist candidate may very well win this afternoon. And what of the US? Contemporary American Jews are often sympathetic to liberal ideas on social issues and to Democratic Party candidates for president. American Jewry is more liberal than many other American ethnic groups on non-economic matters. These attitudes may, to some degree, be descended from the left-wing sentiments held by some sectors of the American Jewish population in earlier generations. But to say that many American Jews are liberal is by no means to say that they are radical or leftist. American Jewry, by and large, committed to private ownership of the means of production, and as a whole better off economically than significant portions of the American population, does not self-identify with the traditional political left at this point in its history, but rather with mainstream American political institutions and ideals. In sum, current Jewish political opinion in the largest Jewish communities, Israel, the United States, and France, which collectively constitute the overwhelming bulk of world Jewry, corroborates the idea that the one-time ties between Jews and the left can best be explained by political, economic, and sociological conditions which existed in the 19th century and which went out of existence in the 20th, rather than by reference to Jewish religious ideas or Jewish racial characteristics. The marginality of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, signaled by the lack of opportunity for Jews in major institutions in Tsarist Russia, poor living and working conditions not only in Eastern Europe but also in the United States, the explicit anti-Semitism of right-wing political movements, and on the other hand, the relative openness of left-wing movements, led some Jews in areas such as the Russian Empire, Galicia, and the US to affiliate with the political left at specific points in time. The dramatically altered conditions in which most Jews live in the 21st century have resulted in a very different Jewish political constellation. And yet, some Jews here and elsewhere continue to identify with the left. There was a visible Jewish presence in Occupy Wall Street, and certain of the historic organizations of the Jewish left in America, like the Workmen's Circle, could best be described as down but not out. I am thus left with questions and not with answers. How ought we to explain alterations in the relationship between the State of Israel, Israelis, and the left? To what degree, if any, can past or present anti-Semitism help us to understand approaches taken by the left to matters of special interest to Jewish communities? What is the significance of historic participation by Jews in communist movements, and what is the impact of that participation on Jews who live in Eastern Europe today? In what ways does a gendered perspective shed light on the relationships with which we are concerned? How did the events and social movements of the 1960s and of the decades immediately thereafter alter Jewish political opinion in the United States? It is to these questions, among others, that we will now collectively turn. Thank you.